Friends, we venture on in our exploration of the Ten Commandments today as we examine commandment number 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold guiltless anyone who misuses his name. Now, just like the first commandment, one cannot examine this commandment without acknowledging the primitive and barbaric laws that surrounded it, even in the Bible itself. Like the first commandment, disobeying this commandment came with the threat of the death penalty by stoning, as found in Leviticus 24 from verse 15. Now, according to the book of Leviticus, Moses is even described as presiding over such a stoning. A young man had been found to have cursed the Lord, and so we read in Leviticus 24 from verse 12, "Then they put him in custody, so that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take outside the camp him who has cursed. Let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him." This is gruesome stuff. Sounds almost like a news report out of ISIS. Then we go on. Then Moses spoke to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him. The Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses. The violent and barbaric nature of such a text reminds us that we need to be very careful of turning to the Old Testament in a simplistic way as a source of moral guidance. If we are honest with ourselves, Moses, one who is upheld by many as a biblical hero and even as a prophet of God, is described as perpetrating the very same violent and barbaric behavior that we would condemn in the Taliban and in the Islamic State today. And even more than that, if we take the verse in Leviticus 24 literally, then truly God himself is ultimately guilty of ordering Moses to carry out this primitive act of barbarism in the first place. Now, I, for one, cannot worship a God who would have given such instructions, whether it be to Moses or anyone else. And it's for this reason that I cannot take these stories in the Old Testament as being literally true and absolutely authoritative. It's for this reason I believe that these stories need to be read rather as legends more than history. And as such, like all ancient legends and mythology, they might still contain archetypal and poetic truths for us, but not literal truths. Getting back to the third commandment about not using the Lord's name in vain, or not misusing the Lord's name, as some translations put it, apart from the danger of being stoned to death, the Old Testament stories also suggest that God himself could be extremely dangerous if one was to offend him. Joy Davidman writes that thus the third commandment is not just a nice Nelly-ish warning against profanity. It's much more like the sort of warning that you see around power plants, danger, high voltage. For the ancient Hebrews seem to have thought that God was like a live electricity wire. 2 Samuel 4 relates how Uzzah, who had touched the Ark of the Covenant unwarily whilst trying to keep it from falling, was struck dead by the indwelling power. And the implied moral of that story, and again I would call it a legend, seems to have been, be careful how you touch God. He is dangerous. It was probably for this reason that Jewish people at some point stopped using God's name at all. It was too sacred to be spoken, and if truth be told, probably considered too dangerous to be spoken, in case you misused it accidentally and you ended up getting zapped. And as a result, the name Yahweh, Jehovah, ceased to be used, and in its place Jewish people used the word Adonai, which means the Lord. I guess the question that one might ask is it true? Is God going to strike us down if we use God's name in vain. The truth of the matter is that with all the profanity and blasphemy that happens in our world today, there are very few instances that I'm aware of people literally being struck down dead because they have misused God's name or blasphemed against God. If God is not going to zap us if we misuse God's name, in what way might this commandment still speak to us today? How might we interpret this commandment through the life and ministry of Jesus, who, as the author of the book of Hebrews describes him, is the author and perfecter of our faith? The first question one might ask is, what is a name? What is the meaning and significance of a name? In most ancient cultures, including ancient Hebrew culture, a name wasn't just a label. A name was thought of as embodying something of the character and personality of a person. Now, I think most of us would have some inkling of this. We probably have all had the experience of meeting someone and feeling like their name really suited their personality completely. But we've also had the experience of being introduced to someone and feeling a certain disjunction between the person that we've been introduced to and the name by which they have been called. Have you ever had the experience of saying to yourself, but she really didn't look like a Jane? At the very least, it may be because she seems so different from another Jane that we have come to know well. But it does reveal that at a very ordinary level, like many ancient cultures, we also have a tendency of correlating certain names with people's character and personality. And that leads us on to another question. In light of Jesus' life and teaching, what is the name, the character, and personality of God? In the Old Testament, God's name was often associated with anger, unpredictability, punishment, and danger. I think there are many people today who genuinely fear God, and hearing God's name being invoked may even bring a feeling of fear and insecurity. And reading stories of Uzzah touching the Ark of the Covenant and being struck dead reinforces this sense that God is dangerous. But whereas many of the Old Testament stories present God as dangerous, jealous, moody, capricious, and even vindictive, if Paul's letter to the Colossians is right, that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God, then, like the writer of John's epistle, we would have to come to the conclusion that God's name, God's character, God's nature, God's personality is in fact love. 1 John 4 verse 16. God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And so, as the English hymn writer Florence May Hoatzin puts it so beautifully in one of her children's hymns, God whose name is love, happy children we, listen to the hymn that we sing to thee. And then in the last verse, bless us everyone, singing here to thee, God whose name is love. Loving may we be. In closing, I'd like to get back to the commandment not to misuse God's name. And I'd like to suggest a conclusion by saying that to misuse God's name would be to use God's name in any way, shape, or form that is unloving and unkind. It is to use God's name for any other purpose other than the purpose of love. And so I believe, for example, that God's name was misused and abused here on the island of Ireland in the way mother and baby homes were run by churches, in ways that were uncompassionate, judgmental, abusive, and oppressive. God's name has been misused and abused when it's been invoked to call people to war and acts of violence. God's name is misused and abused when it's used by politicians to try and get votes, when such politicians are acting out of selfish ambition rather than being motivated by genuine love and care. God's name is misused and abused when a businessman or a businesswoman puts a Bible on their desk, pretending to be honorable and honest, and yet doing business in ways that are less than honest and less than honorable. To misuse and to abuse God's name, I believe, can even happen, and perhaps maybe even most especially can happen, when a preacher, a priest, or a minister presents an image of God in their preaching that is anything less than love itself. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus turns the third commandment around. Instead of saying that we should not misuse the name of God, Jesus teaches us to pray, "May your name be kept holy." God's name is kept holy when it is only used for purposes of love. And so may we keep God's name holy, as together with Florence May Hodson we say, "Bless us everyone, singing here to thee, God, whose name is love. Loving may we be." Amen.